9-year-old nonprofit American Women Writers National Museum in Washington, D.C. Usually we meet in the National Press Club at Washington, D.C., but the Press Club, like everyone else, has had issues with availability and so on. So we had to move to Zoom. This is only our second Zoom adventure, but we're doing our best. So thank you for being tolerant of the technical things. Before I introduce and we are recording this. If you missed it or you wanted to see it, but you didn't see everything or whatever, it'll be on YouTube in about 3 days. It usually takes us about 3 days to get up on YouTube.
You're home. Okay, I have a. Is there all these people?
A little preview of coming attractions.
Yeah.
Oh, whoops.
Whoop. Okay, so I'm going to go downstairs.
Children. Preview of coming attractions in
an hour.
How can I get Donna's back? In January, we're having a speaker on Eudora Welty. Dr. Ford, who's at Baylor University, is a nationally known expert on Eudora Welty. She's speaking. And in February, we hope to have a speaker on women in early TV. We're doing women in early radio now, so we hope to have someone in early TV. Just to introduce Donna. She's on our screen. I'll do a speaker screen in just a second, I hope. Donna is a former DJ, a music director, and radio consultant. She's spent more than 3 decades in broadcasting, and she's currently professor of communications and media studies at Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass. Oh, by the way, I forgot. Did I mention donations now? Okay. Just a quick plug for donations. Next month is National Giving Month, so we hope that you'll consider a donation to Autumn. If you want to donate, no amount is too small. And you go to www.AmericanWomenWritersNationalMuseum.org. I don't know what happened there. And you click on the contributions button on the left-hand side. Then you can contribute through PayPal or through with using a credit card. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much. Anyway, to get back, as you can see, this is a work in progress. And Donna can be heard on a number of online podcasts. She's the author of 6 books and many articles. And she's been on national TV, on TV programs like PBS News and CBS Sunday Morning. Obviously, they're more adept at this technical stuff than I am. And she's going to speak to us today on Invisible Stars, Women in Early Radio. So, Ms. Halper, thank you for joining us and thank you for being so tolerant.
Thank you very much.
So there you go, speaker screen.
Hey, don't applaud yet. I may not be any good.
I'm sure. Go ahead.
But, okay, so can everybody hear? Can everybody see? Splendido. Okay, so with or without pictures, let me just start by saying what a privilege to be here. I've been in broadcasting off and on actually for 4 decades, and I'm still involved peripherally. I get to be a guest on various programs and on podcasts and webcasts, etc. And now I'm here. And last week I was in Pakistan.
Oh,
so all joking aside, I mean, me, a Jewish kid from Dorchester, Massachusetts. But there's something to be said for the Zoom world, because as Eleanor and I have discussed, there's no way I could have gotten time off from my university to fly out to DC, where I used to live, by the way, in the middle of the day and then come back and teach 2 classes. It just wasn't going to happen. So this is actually kind of a blessing. My life's work, so thank you, Eleanor. My life's work has been telling the stories of the forgotten women and minorities and men in broadcasting, because the truth is there have been male allies who understood that the industry needed to be more diverse, okay? It's nice to look at all the people that were just like, oh, they tried to stop us, but that wasn't the whole story. And what I'm about is telling the whole story. So let me take you back to a time before women could vote. So it's 1898, and your name is Eunice Randall. And girls are considered so unimportant in the small town where you're born that you're not even written into the ledger that lists the births. By the way, I just want to warn you, there's a little bug that Zoom has where it overheats when it's doing a large broadcast. So you're going to hear a fan come on every now and then. Nothing's wrong. It's just a fan. And it will stop in about 20 seconds. Everybody knows about it. Nobody knows what to do about it.
Can everybody else unmute?
You'll find it's listed as a bug, and they're like, we're working on it. That doesn't help me, but I'm glad they're working on it. Anyway, so women are considered so unimportant in the little town that Eunice is born in that she's not written into the birth ledger. And she doesn't find out that she doesn't exist until years later when she goes to get married and finds out that she doesn't exist. Imagine her surprise. So she grows up on a farm in Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. And she has no electricity on her farm, but that's no big deal. I mean, that's just the way people live in her little town. Her father already has her married off. He knows who she's going to marry. He knows what she's going to do. In fact, from what I can gather, the big compromise was she got to go to high school. Okay. And she goes, she does pretty well. I've seen her report card. And she decides she wants to go to art school. Well, her father takes a dim view of this, but she does something that for her generation is remarkably courageous. She decides to get on the bus, Gus, make a new plan, Stan, and she just decides to go to the big city and go to art school. Now, her mother supports it. Her mother's in favor of it, but her father isn't happy. She goes to Boston, which is the nearest big city, and in Boston, she starts art school and runs out of money. Now, at this point, she's about to come back to Mattapoisett in disgrace, and World War I breaks out. Now, that's not good news for most people because guys have to go over and fight the war. But it's really good news for women and minorities who otherwise would not have been hired in a whole bunch of different jobs. And suddenly, there's all of these companies with openings. Eunice goes in, says, I need a job. And the nearest place that was hiring was a company called Amrad. There's no reason you would ever have heard of it. They made radio receivers, and they made equipment for ham radio. Now, Eunice had become interested in ham radio as a kid for no apparent reason. She was always different. She loved to crochet, she loved to knit, and she loved ham radio. She was in both worlds. Today, that wouldn't be regarded as particularly different. But back then, it was like, wow, she likes to play basketball. And she likes to crochet. And what is she? Well, she was Eunice. That's what she was. And she decided that she was interested in ham radio. And so she went to her brother's farm because he did have electricity. And she taught herself Morse code. And when we have more time, I'll tell you more about her life. But suffice it to say, it stood her in good stead when she got a job at that manufacturing company that made radio receivers. Because they looked at her like, what do you know about this little lady? And she was like, I've been doing Morse code for years. Thank you very much. And so she was able to get a job as what then was called a draftsman. But being ahead of her time, Eunice didn't want to be called a draftsman. She wanted to be called a drafts lady. And so she was. And she did technical drawings. And when the war ended, Amrad put a radio station on the air because it was 1920 and commercial radio was blossoming. I just got done giving a couple of talks about the fact that KDKA in Pittsburgh was not the first radio station. That is a myth, the triumph of publicity over fact. Eunice worked at one of the first radio stations, and she was by all accounts the first radio announcer, the first woman radio announcer in the East. And she may have been one of the first in the entire United States. She goes on the air around 1919. And contrary to the myth that the Republic was going to fall if women were broadcasters, the Republic didn't fall, and people loved her. She was getting fan mail all over the place and marriage proposals. And she became very popular. She also became very versatile because in the early days of broadcasting, you had to be. This is like 1920, 1921, 22, 23. All radio is live. And she's doing the news. She's playing the music. She's announcing. She's doing the transmitter maintenance. I mean, you name it, Eunice did it. She did the stolen car reports. The police would send over reports of stolen cars, and she would announce them on the news. And when guests didn't show up, as often happened in live radio, Eunice sang in church. And so when a guest didn't show up, the announcer on the air was expected to start singing. Fortunately, Eunice could sing, and so she did. Long story short, Eunice had a very popular, very successful radio career until 1925. In 1925, the company she worked for went bankrupt, as often happened in the early days of broadcasting when everything was a volunteer activity. And as anyone who's ever run a volunteer organization will tell you, some people help, some people just want to reap the benefits. So there were a lot of people reaping the benefits and not a lot of people paying the bills. AMRAD went under. Eunice didn't latch on anywhere else. By that point in time, she was married. Turned out her marriage ended in divorce, but in those days, women were supposed to marry, so she married. Bottom line, she stays involved in amateur radio, in ham radio, and she stays involved in drafting. She continues to be an expert in technical drawings for years. She also sets up a number of ham radio networks. She teaches the blind how to use ham radio. She does conferences all over the country where she becomes a role model for women in radio. And she becomes completely forgotten. When she dies in 1982, no one knew who she was. Years later, your humble servant is trying to find out, who were my mothers? Who were the people that were on the radio in the early days? And I look in the books, lots of nothing. And I'm like, that can't be right, because I was the first woman in the history of Northeastern University in Boston to ever be on the radio, and that was in 1968. There had to be somebody before that. And that sent me on a quest, which, like I said, became my life's work. And along the way, I met a woman. I don't have time to tell you her story, but I will at some future point. But I met a woman who told me that her aunt had been a broadcaster. And I'm like, who's your aunt? And she said, Eunice Randall. And I'm like, never heard of her. And she tells me the story of how she has been trying for years to get someone to tell Eunice's story. And I started looking through old newspapers, and I'm like, this is wrong on so many levels. She was the first woman in the East, and her reward is to be completely forgotten? Wrong answer. Auntie Donna's going to take this on. And I did. And oh, my friends, I have spent the past 4 decades telling Eunice's story all over the country. And it led to my book, Invisible Stars, A Social History of Women in American Broadcasting, which you can get on Amazon.com, said Donna, shilling for her book. The second edition came out in 2014. And I'm proud to tell you that Eunice is now in a whole bunch of history books. Eunice will never be forgotten again. Thank you and good night. But it shouldn't have been that way. And that led me to wondering who else was forgotten. So in addition to Eunice, that led me to looking for other groundbreaking women. Time does not permit all of them here today. I found the story of Marie Zimmerman, who was the first woman to own a radio station in 1922, also completely written out of history. And I found the story of Bertha Brainerd. Bertha Brainerd was born in 1890, and she grew up in Orange, New Jersey. And back in those days, the early 1900s, the options for women were pretty limited. She decided that she wanted to be an actress, because back then, teacher, nurse, secretary, actress. And then you got married real young. And Bertha decided, actress, yeah, that'd be good. Except again, World War I breaks out. Now, she doesn't go to work at a factory. She knows how to drive a car, which was also unusual for women. I wrote a chapter in a book about that. Eunice knew how to drive. So did Bertha. And Bertha decided that she would help her country by driving for the Red Cross. And she drove an ambulance for the Red Cross during World War I. After the war, she tries to become an actress. It ain't happening. It's harder than it looks, particularly if you're in Orange, New Jersey, which is not exactly the Hollywood of the East. So she decides that maybe there's something she can do with her interest in theater, because there's this new mass medium that has come onto the scene, this thing called radio. And a lot of radio stations are coming on the air in 1921, 1922, and she's listening, and the programming she's hearing is just, ew, it's really amateur. And she decides, hey, I'm a good speaker. I know theater. I could put these two things together. I could do a show about theater. I could do like reviews and interviews with stars. And I mean, local people, they come to New York, the actors and actresses. And she proposes to a station in Newark, New Jersey, WJZ, long gone and hard to find, but a pioneering station. She proposes that she's going to do a theater show where she interviews people from the stage, she interviews movie stars, etc., etc. They put her on. People love the idea. Her program is called Broadcasting Broadway, and it leads to her getting quite a following. And ultimately, and again, by the way, the Republic doesn't fall because there's women on the air. But in fairness, the reason a lot of women were not allowed on the air in the early days is not just sexism. It has to do with the fact that the early carbon microphones distorted your voice and kind of made you sound like this, unless you had a big, deep voice to begin with. I've heard some early transcriptions from Eunice Randall. She had a really resonant, mellifluous voice. She would have sounded good in any era, okay? And the truth is that she was able to sound so relevant to the audience that they loved her. Same with Bertha Brainerd. The audience looked forward to, who is she going to interview this week? She had a really good ear for what the public wanted. And gradually, even though she was female, her station moves her up, and she moves into management, where she gets asked to kind of audition the talent. This is going to stand her in very good stead, because WJZ gets bought by NBC, which, by the way, in the early days is not called NBC, just like the First World War wasn't called the First World War. It was called the Great War. As I tell my students, nobody knew there was going to be a second war, so it was just called the Great War or the World War, okay? Ditto for NBC. NBC wasn't called by its initials yet because it wasn't famous. It was called the National Broadcasting Company. CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Mutual comes along next in 1934. And then in 1943, you finally get what becomes ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. It's out of the remnants of a second NBC network. There was NBC Red, NBC Blue, way too much detail. Let me move on. So the truth is that Bertha Brainerd suddenly finds herself picking talent, not just for WJZ in Newark, but for the parent company, NBC. And she's really good at it. She ends up becoming the program manager for the network. No woman has ever done this before. She picks some really big hits. Some of you have heard of a program called The Goldbergs. Bertha Brainerd was the one who picked that show, okay? Some of you may have heard of a famous singer named Rudy Valley. Bertha Brainerd heard Rudy Valley singing and said, yeah, this guy, and put him on the network, okay? The Metropolitan Opera, not Oprah, opera. And all joking aside, that's how she got the name, but never mind. The truth is, and that could be an urban legend, but The truth is that Bertha knew that as much as she might not like opera, a lot of other people did. And because most people back then didn't have a ton of bucks, they weren't going to the opera. Just the rich people were. So she figured, hey, why not have a special program where we make a little opera available? Some people will like it, some people won't, but it's a service. Gives people a little chance to vicariously experience being wealthy. She put the opera on the air. She did a whole bunch of other stuff too. In fact, during her 25 years with NBC, she got a number of famous people their start on the network, auditioning them and giving them their shows. She finally retired due to poor health in 1946, and she got married. She'd been married to her job before then because in those days it was either or. Either you married or you had a career. Turns out there was a guy from an advertising agency who had had a crush on her since forever. And he couldn't say anything. He was still married. I believe his wife passed. And then he gradually started letting Bertha know that he kind of was interested in her, but she was focused on her job. She retires. They get married. And a couple of months later, she dies of a heart attack. Yeah, it was not a story with a happy ending. But wait, it gets worse. A couple of years later, NBC writes their history for Variety magazine. Guess who they never mention? I was outraged when I read that, okay? When I was doing my research, I was like, and this is the thanks she gets? 25 years as the first woman network executive, and they don't even include her in their... And Auntie Donna decided, yes, Roseanne, you are totally correct. History is written by the winners, and in a patriarchal culture. And again, I'm not saying anything against men. I'm married to one. Got nothing against men. But I do have something against history that is not inclusive, because that history isn't accurate. Writing out minorities because you happen to be white isn't accurate. Writing out women because you happen to be a guy isn't accurate. And I'm always about just let's tell the whole story. So the fact that Bertha was written out just irritated me. And I made sure that she was prominently mentioned in my book. I made sure that there was stuff on her Wikipedia entry that was accurate. And this is not just me, Donna. I'm saying this becomes something that a lot of people start doing in the 1980s and 1990s. Why it took so long, who can say? But anyway, so that's Bertha Brainerd, one of the first women, if not the first woman, to be a network executive. There was one other, her name was Judith Waller. If I ever get to give part 2 here, I'll talk about her. Another woman who's worth talking about had a little different experience. And it may be because she was perceived by the culture as being beautiful. She was kind of like a model. And that wasn't what she asked for. I mean, again, one of the things women could be back then. Okay, so Catherine Cravens was born in a little town in Texas in 1898, and she lived to see society change. Now, her father was wealthy. He was a doctor, and I'm not saying they were richy rich, but I'm saying he had the money to spend to send her to good schools. So when she wanted to be an actress, she got to go to really good performing arts schools, and she got to advance herself in that way. She went out to Hollywood, and she actually was in some silent movies. You can find her. Now, I'd be lying if I said she was like the star. She wasn't. But she was able to carve out a little name for herself. And then she also did stage acting, and she did a number of performances all over the country. Kind of settled in the Midwest because she married a guy from the Midwest. They got divorced years later, but at the time she relocated to the Midwest because that's where he was. And in the Midwest, in St. Louis, they were desperately looking for radio actors and actresses. Because as I said, in radio's formative years, everything's live. Tape hasn't been invented yet. So you want to do a show, you're going to show up at the studio and do it live. And there was a big need for live performers. Now, by this time, as I said, the networks are around, so they're kind of professionalizing it. They're using like the biggest names. Good for them. But in the smaller cities, they needed talent. And Catherine was like, I got talent. I've been like in movies. I've been on the stage. I could do this. I could make a few bucks. And so she applied to a station in St. Louis called KWK. And she later went on a station that is still around called KMOX in St. Louis. And she did radio drama and became quite good at it. Except she wanted to do more. And she was very interested in current events. Now, again, there's a myth that like men won't listen to women doing news. And Catherine was like, because why? I don't know why. And so she proposed the idea of doing what today we would call human interest. Human interest is like stories where there's like interviews with people and it tells like an emotional story, maybe happy, maybe sad, or you bond with the characters. And she proposes this. And of course, because she's a woman, it's decided that like, we'll call the show News Through a Woman's Eyes, because evidently my eyes are different from somebody else. Who knows? But she decides to just go with it. Okay, fine, news through a woman's eyes. She's a very good interviewer. She's able to get stories that nobody else gets. And CBS takes notice of her and hires her to come to New York and do News Through a Woman's Eyes on the CBS radio network. Now, this is a bigger deal than you might think, because here again, there are 2 women doing news back then in the entire United States. Dorothy Thompson is one. We'll talk about her some other time. Catherine Cravens is the other. Imagine you're a little girl growing up and you turn on the radio and there's Catherine Cravens. Okay, fine. Some of what she was doing by today's standards would be considered gendered, but you got nothing to compare it to. She's doing news. Now, it's perhaps considered soft news and features, but she actually covers some actual newsmakers. She covers a death penalty case. She covers a whole bunch of other interesting stories. She's a really good storyteller. She does something else that has not been done by anyone, male or female. She embraces a new industry, the airline industry. She embraces aviation and she starts using airplanes to get to her talks, to get to her interviews. She becomes known as the flying reporter. And for years, she flies all over the United States. When World War II breaks out, she starts flying all over the world. She goes to Europe and reports for newspapers and for radio. She's on Mutual by that point in time. She becomes a syndicated columnist writing about news. She also is fashionable. She knows she's attractive, and she decides to make it work for her by being kind of a fashion plate and showing that a woman can report the news, get out there, go to 22 countries, interview newsmakers, and still look good while she's doing it. And she did. Catherine Cravens had a long and successful career. She wrote a book. She wrote a bunch of short stories. If you Google her, you will find all kinds of stuff. Here again, I know because I helped to write some of it. But in some cases, it was others because people in Texas are really proud of her. She was a local girl who made good. So there you are, Catherine Cravens, one of the first newswomen to be a woman. Newswoman to be a woman is sort of a redundant thing, but I'm doing this live. She is the first female commentator, is what I was trying to say, along with Dorothy Thompson. So that brings me to the one other person I have time to talk about. And I wanted to talk about somebody African American. And in this universe, America is still segregated. And in a parallel universe, there are Black women writing for Black newspapers. There are Black baseball players playing in Black baseball leagues. And the white audience, by and large, is unaware of all of this, which is kind of unfortunate. I've found some wonderful female reporters who are African American. I'm starting to tell their stories too. And one of them was a radio announcer named Martha Jean, the Queen, Steinberg. And her real name was Jones, but her married name was Steinberg. She married a jazz musician named Luther Steinberg. She kept the name. And Martha Jean also never planned on going into radio. First of all, radio was segregated back when she was growing up. Nobody would have hired her, except as a performer. I mean, Black singers were hired. Of course, in the South, they had to come in the back door, which is despicable when you think about it. But welcome to the world under segregation. But she didn't want to be a singer. She just couldn't see that for herself. She wanted to be a nurse, but there weren't a lot of Black schools that taught nursing near where she lived. And unfortunately, there weren't a lot of options. So she decided she'd become a model. And she did, by some account, she did study nursing, but she found that modeling was more of a possibility. Fortunately for her, the industry is starting to change by the 1940s when she's growing up. The first Black formatted radio station goes on the air in 1948, WDIA in Memphis. It is owned by white people, but it's the first station to have an all-Black format. Martha Jean sees a possibility. She knows about fashion. She knows about a whole bunch of stuff. She auditions, she gets the gig. She has a really, really nice voice. She wins a contest to be an announcer. And the audience loves her. She has a very sexy voice. Now, again, not intending to, she just kind of does. And the guys like her, the ladies like her. She becomes a very popular DJ on WDIA in Memphis. And gradually, her profile is elevated. They do a contest at the station because everybody in those days has to have a radio name. So they decide that she'll be Martha Jean the Queen. Why the Queen? Some people say, well, she was tall for a woman and she walked in a very regal way. Other people say, nah, it was a radio contest and they picked the name for her and Martha Jean the Queen kind of rhymed, and there you have it. So Martha Jean Steinberg, Martha Jean the Queen, gets divorced in 1962 and decides that radio's a great occupation. She's still having fun. She's going to stay in it. She's not going to try to find another husband and get married and have kids. She's going to continue in radio. She leaves Memphis, gets a job in Detroit at a Black station there. By now, Black-themed radio is sweeping the country. And she becomes legendary for Detroit's Black audience. She's more than just playing the hits. She has a very soothing, very calming voice. And she starts doing some news stories, and she starts taking on some of the events of the day, including the fight for racial justice. She becomes a spokesperson for ending segregation and for promoting racial equality. Now, I know what you're thinking. Don, it's the 60s. What do you mean she's trying to end segregation? Well, there's still de facto segregation. Okay, just because Brown versus the Board got passed in 1954, that doesn't mean the entire universe went, wow, let's integrate. Yeah, exactly. It's still going on today. And Martha Jean sees that Detroit is about ready to explode. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of resentment. Does this seem like it could be written today? Well, yes, it could. But Martha Jean, as many announcers in many cities, she's a role model for a lot of folks. And she gets out there and creates calm among the audience. She gets the audience to do volunteer work. She gets the audience to become involved in projects to make Detroit better. she becomes a real name in keeping the city in a positive place and someone that the Black community can talk to. Now, she starts experimenting with talk shows. Her whole thing is she reaches out to who she called the forgotten people, the people that didn't feel like they had a voice, and she became their voice. Years later, she decides that she wants to be a minister, and she becomes one, and she starts a congregation. She continues to broadcast, but now she's broadcasting religious programming where she's playing a lot of gospel music, but she's still a legendary broadcaster in a city that thinks of her as someone who brings peace and calm. And years later, she's still doing that. She died in the year 2000, and to this day, there are people that remember her, not for her days playing the hits, but for her days bringing calm to a city that needed it. So those are just a few of the people that I could talk about. I could go on for hours, and I probably shouldn't, so I won't. But I hope I've been halfway interesting. And let me just say that what I want to do is to continue promoting the names of the people that have been forgotten. What I want to keep doing is promoting the allies who were there for us, and also the people who tried to stop us. Because the truth is, when you're determined, you're unstoppable. In 1980, I started a radio consulting business, doing market research and management consulting. Someone that I worked with, a guy that I had worked with, said to me, "You'll never succeed at that. You'll never be anything. You should just give up." He said it in a more profane manner, but that's basically what he said. 3 years later, I won the award for Radio Consultant of the Year from the Pop Music Survey. I was the first woman to win it. And I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm just saying, there are so many stories out there that deserve to be told. When I was 55 years old, I went back for my PhD and got it at 64. I'm 73 now and still young and cute. And I'm still out there seeking out the stories of the women who have been forgotten, the women who contributed to our lives, the women who made it possible for us to be who we are today. We told their stories then, and now there are future stories that we can tell, and I hope we will tell them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
If you got questions, I may or may not have answers. If I don't have answers, I'll make it up. And if you want me to send you as a file a copy of my talk, or the photos that I would have shown you, or just about anything else. Some of those photos are in my book, Invisible Stars. Others are on webcasts and podcasts that I've given. There's visuals for them. If I can be of any help to anyone, my email is very easy to find. It's DLH, which is my initials, Donna Lee Halper, DLH, at donnahalper.com. DONNAHA as in applesauce, LP as in potato, ER, no N's, no T's, DLH at donnahalper.com. Get in touch. It would be my pleasure to chat about anything at all with regard to the history of women in broadcasting or in print journalism for that matter. I work on all of it. I also do a lot of work with baseball history. I found one of the first women's sports writers way back in the early, like 1906, hello? She had a beat for 6 years, okay? There's so many stories about what they said we could never do, and yet we did it. The thing is, I don't want that to be forgotten. Those could be role models for people. Those could be the next generation of people going, wow, if she could do it, I could do it. And I must tell you, have I got time to tell a quick story?
Well, we're kind of near the end. We've got 1 minute left.
Okay, if I have 1 minute, then I won't tell the story, but life goes on. Was I okay? Was I halfway interesting, I hope? Thank you, Eleanor, for having me. I'm most appreciative. And as I said, if you got questions, since time doesn't permit, please feel free to get in touch. I love you dearly. Thank you for having me.
You've invited me to do a terrible pun, which is you may not be a helper, but you are a helper. Oh, sorry. Anyway, thank you very much. I was trying to make I like puns. Thank you very much. For your pleasure to have you here, and we'll be posted on YouTube. So anyone who wants to watch it, please feel free to do so. And American Women Writers National Museum, www. American Women Writers National Museum is where the YouTube will be. We'll also be on YouTube generally. So thank you so much. We're going to sign off now. Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.